Hello, I'm making a tribute to my father and posting every photograph that I can find of him and his family. For posterity's sake, I'd like to put these things online because it'll be there, hopefully, even when I'm not around. There'll still be this tribute. And to pay honor and tribute to my father, Raymond Ros Shenk, whose birthday anniversary was yesterday, and I'm starting a timer because I want to make some notes to myself where to put the pictures in, some of them. His birthday was yesterday, anniversary. If he were alive today, he would be 105 years old. He was born April 4th, 1918 in Wilmington, Illinois. Long time ago, different America. I'm just going to make notes on pictures here, where to put them in. It's going to be probably a long video. So I'm just going to start out. Here's a wedding picture of his parents, of their wedding day, and the whole wedding party. And this looks like it must have been around 1910 or 1915. I'm not sure. We'll say 1915. And seated in the ground, I know who some of these people were. Actually, the young girl in the white dress, seated on the ground, was Aunt Toot, Aunt Marjorie. They called her Aunt Tootie. I don't know why. I mean, we're talking, she got that nickname 100 years ago. So, who knows? You know, Aunt Tootie. She was very beloved by the family. And the woman actually took care of me at times when I was a baby. And I just remember her as an old woman, that she really loved me. And more on her as I go through. She took care of my father too, when he was a child. So that's the wedding party of my grandparents. My father's mother and father are in this. Raymond Ross and Myrtle Randolph were married. And my father and his brother, Clarence, were the offspring from that union. Clarence came first, his nickname, well, more on them when I... Okay, for posterity's sake, the few people here, I know who they were based on conversations with my father years ago. Standing from the left to the right. The two young men standing on the left are two of my grandfather Raymond's brothers. I don't know their names. I used to. Standing next to them is my grandfather's wife, my grandmother Myrtle Randolph. Standing next to her, fourth from the left, is my grandfather Raymond Ros Shenk, presumably on his wedding day. And standing next to my grandfather, fifth, sixth, and seventh, are his other three brothers. He had 5 brothers, which is a good thing when you're a farmer. I'm afraid I don't know the other people next to them, but if you go all the way standing on the right, the man with looks like he's holding a pocket watch, that was Myrtle's brother, Randolph. I'm sorry, he was a Randolph. His name was Albert. His nickname was Buzz, B-U-Z, Buzz. And my father remembers him as being a man with a terrific sense of humor. You don't get that in these old photos. Next to Albert, from the left to the right, I don't know who the man is, but next to him, kind of timid, you just see her head poking through, was Albert's sister, Mary Randolph, my grandmother's sister, Mary Randolph. They were all from Scotland, the Randolphs, immigrated. And all I know about her, my father said that she never married, and she was a really kind, sweet person, but she always just stayed to herself. Now, seated in the middle, I only know a few of these people, and where my grandfather Raymond is standing, right below him, the woman in the white dress seated, that's my grandmother Nellie Randolph. Seated next to her left, fourth from the left, is my grandfather Clarence Randolph. Seated next to him, the woman looks kind of austere, is my great-grandmother actually. I don't know her first name, unfortunately, but she was my great-grandmother on the Shenk side. I do know that her husband was a Mennonite, formerly a Mennonite, who broke with the Mennonites and was very successful when he moved out with her. He broke with the Mennonites. Oh, I do know her name. I'm sorry. Seated next to Clarence Randolph is my great-grandmother on the Shenk side, and her name was Sarah Carter. And she married my great-grandfather, Joseph Shenk, who was a Mennonite in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And he left the Mennonites to marry her when they were younger. And they did very, very well for themselves. My middle name is after her husband, which I presume is deceased, why he's not in the picture. I could be wrong. But that's Sarah Carter Shenk, my great-grandmother. And Joseph was her husband, former Mennonite. Now, I don't know any of the other seated people, unfortunately. I can tell you seated in the grass, in the white dress, was Aunt Tootie. That was her nickname. Her real name was Marjorie Randolph. She was my grandmother Myrtle's sister, younger sister by the looks of it. I don't know who the girl is sitting with her, but in the white dress, seated there is my Aunt Marjorie, Aunt Toot. And she actually took care of me. I do remember her as an old woman. She was very, very fond of me. Left me her wedding rings. More on her later in the video. But I thought I would take a moment to talk about the people in this video for anybody in my family who's wondering who these people were. These are the ones that I can identify, just what I know. You know, this was over 100 years ago. Well over, so that's what I've got. I suppose if you did some research, you'd want to get hold of the Brockmans in Wilmington that were related to my to the Shenk family. They might have more information on it in Wilmington, Illinois. But that's all I know based on what I wrote down a year after my father died. That's when I put all this together. Those are the notes that are scribbled down below. You can't read it. All right, that's all. Okay, here's a baby picture of my grandmother Myrtle with my father, who was seated on the left, and his brother, who's a year or two older than him, Clarence, seated on the right. And my grandmother Myrtle is holding them. Clarence has his hand on his hat. Clarence's nickname was Turk, T-U-R-K, like turkey, because he had like a goblet underneath his chin. I guess he had a weak chin. You know, I got one of those. Now, when you get older, you grow a beard to hide it. He had one when he was a child, so they called him Turk, short for turkey. My father, seated there, looking quite serious. His nickname was Bud, B-U-D, Bud. Everybody that knew him called him Bud when he was a kid. And his mother, my grandmother Myrtle, I didn't know this till, I don't know, my father was, he got a letter from a cousin in the 90s. And his cousin was talking about his mother, remembering his mother, and that she had a very thick Scottish accent. In fact, the whole Randolph family was from Scotland. And I didn't know they were from Scotland. I thought that was kind of cool. You know, right about the time Braveheart came out and all that stuff. And, you know, I thought it was pretty cool. I asked my dad, I didn't know she was from Scotland. He says, oh yeah. My father didn't speak of her much. She died when he was a baby. Really, he said he had only one memory of her, Myrtle, and he said that she suffered horribly for 3 days in the hospital before she died. And she died of rheumatic fever, which could have been from strep throat, which would kill you back then. They didn't have penicillin yet. So Myrtle probably died around 1921. And it's the earliest memory my father had, and the only memory he had of her was her slow, painful death. And I don't even know where she's buried. Somewhere in Illinois. Long time ago. Somewhere. But that's my grandmother. And that's my father and my uncle on the Shenk side. And yeah, they're Scotch, Swiss, mix. Pretty much, you look at me, I've got my ancestry, I've got about 6 or 7 different things going on, but my dad only had 2, Scotch, Swiss, that's it. Switzerland, Bavaria area is where the Shenks came from, and his mother came from Scotland, and the Randolphs are the oldest clan in Scotland. They're related to the first Bruce of Scotland, who was a Viking, Helga the Elder, something like that. And sure enough, my daughter did a DNA test, and they're Scandinavian in our side from that. And I told her that the Scottish side were from Vikings, and they were. So that's that. I'm not sure what else to go on here to cover my dad's life. It spanned 86 years. When his mother died, pictures off. And I'm going to just put some pictures up. Some of them are just going to go up arbitrarily, and some I'm going to talk about. When my father's mother died, my father went to stay. His father kind of lost his mind a bit over the death. And something happened. I don't know what. My dad would not talk about it. But my father went to live with his mother's sister, Aunt Tootie, Aunt Margaret. And here's a picture of Aunt Margaret when she apparently was a nurse a long time ago. And that's Aunt Toot. Very pretty woman. She had quite a personality. But she lived in Chicago on the east side, which my dad would live with her. And Aunt Margaret, Aunt Toot, I used to have a picture of her with her husband, but she married an Irish guy, immigrant, and I don't remember their name. He had a very Irish sounding name. But she married him, and they ran a speakeasy bar during the Prohibition. And I guess my father lived with them above the bar. And right near, within walking distance of Wrigley Stadium, where my dad used to watch all the Chicago Cubs games when he was a kid, in the 1920s and on into the 1930s, when he was a teenager. He didn't miss a single Cubs game, not one. He was a lifelong Chicago Cubs fan, and a lifelong avid baseball fan, period. But Aunt Toot and her husband ran a speakeasy bar. And my father remembered he had a good childhood with her, honestly. They were quite close. And my father remembered the old singer, Perry Como. I don't know if you ever heard him. He was like a crooner, like Frank Sinatra, but a little before Frank Sinatra, around the same time period as Sinatra. He was one of the Italian crooners, the singers, Perry Como. He had a beautiful voice. My father remembered seeing him in bars when Perry Como was just starting out as a teenager. They were the same age, pretty much. My father remembered Al Capone's boys shooting up the neighborhood, as he put it. What else did he saw all the Chicago Cubs. He saw all their games at the Wrigley Stadium. And my dad got a little older during the Depression, when he must have been maybe 16 or 17. He used to hop trains and used to go all the way from Chicago to Abilene, Texas, riding trains with hobos, the colorful hobo history from the Depression, hopping trains, living that way and living in hobo camps. My dad did that. He lived in hobo camps. And I asked him what it was like, and he told me those places were scary places. Pictures off if I have any on. He told me they were scary places. He said you didn't speak to people much. If you had anything at all, you were expected to share it with everybody, be it tobacco or alcohol or food. He said it was not uncommon in these hobo camps of the Depression, outside of these railway yards, because they were all traveling by train then, illegally. He said it was not uncommon for the sun to come up in the morning and there'd be one or two dead guys in the camp that somebody killed for some reason, who knows what. My dad said you just didn't talk to people. They were scary places. So if Hollywood depicts them as really colorful places, yeah, they were, but they could be a very bad place too. That came from my dad. My dad used to hop the train and go to Abilene, Texas, via hopping trains back and forth from Chicago to Texas to see a young woman that he fell in love with. And more on her. She resurfaced a few times in his life. She was a waitress, and they were in love, first love. And then my father, I don't know how he wound up, but he moved to Brooklyn, New York in the late 30s. And he got a job working, loading asbestos onto railroad cars at the shipyards in the late 30s in Brooklyn. And that would wind up, he'd wind up with that mesothelioma or something like that, the cancer, later in life from that, which I'm at risk because I was down there in Manhattan during 9/11. It just occurred to me that I was exposed, just like him, to a lot of asbestos in Manhattan when I was a first responder at the Trade Center on 9/11. That just occurred to me that we have that in common. My father, when he lived in Brooklyn, he loved New York City, but this is old New York City. This is New York City from the 1930s, late 1930s. And I don't know how he wound up there. He was a free spirit, obviously. If he hopped trains from Chicago to Texas and back just to see his girlfriend, it's not conceivable. He went to Brooklyn the same way, for whatever reason. And he played semi-pro baseball. Honestly, he was a very good baseball player. And the story goes, World War II, in 1939, when Hitler, Japan was already doing their thing in the Pacific, and China and Asia and stuff, their atrocities, and World War II was starting out. And in 1939, Hitler invaded the Sudetenland, and then he went on to invade Poland. And even though it would be 2 more years before America got involved, my father said everybody knew we were going to get sucked into it as early as 1939. He said they knew we were going to wind up involved in this stupid war, and they really hated it. It wasn't that they hated Germany or anything like that. They just thought it was stupid, just like this war in the Ukraine right now. Who needs it? You know what I mean? There are better things to do than war. War's stupid. And that's what it's just awful. So my father joined the Navy. And he told me, and this is no disrespect to my father at all, I admire him for this. He joined the Navy because, in his words, he told me he couldn't hurt a mouse. He wanted absolutely no part of land warfare. Here's a picture of my father in boot camp, Navy basic training in Great Lakes Naval Training Center, and he was back in Illinois for that. And there he is as a young man. He must have been like 20 years old here, I guess. And yeah, it's kind of odd, old pictures, And he was in the Navy for the duration of World War II. And as it would turn out, he was on a destroyer, the USS Bainbridge. And here's some pictures of the USS Bainbridge. And my father's on this ship. At the time these pictures were taken, my dad's on there somewhere. He might be one of the sailors you see on the deck. My dad's there. So he was on the USS Bainbridge, DD-246. And they actually would see combat, even though he tried to avoid it by joining the Navy, where he didn't want to personally take part in killing anyone. And that's what he told me. And I think I can honor that. Granted, I joined the Army, and I did all kinds of things: machine gunner, sniper, tank commander, all this stuff. Tank platoon sergeant, all kinds of grenadier. And I thank God that I never had to take anybody's life. And I understand that's part of the job, sadly. But I thank God that I didn't have to. I would have done my job. And my father did his job, and he was in charge of the boiler room. He was a senior man in charge of the boiler room on the USS Bainbridge, DD-246. And he had a lot of stories from that. I'm going to go over some of them. He said they sank a German sub, off of the east coast of America. I think off of North Carolina, Cape Hatteras. I'm not sure which, or Virginia. Somewhere, he told me his ship sunk a German sub. And he said the sub was stuck on a sandbar, and the water was real clear. He said you could stand there and look right over the rails and see the sub beneath their ship. And he said those guys, these were his words, he said those guys didn't stand a chance. And they depth charged the sub and sank it, and a lot of stuff washed up, to include a lot of bodies. And this is what my father told me. He said they laid the bodies out on the deck of his ship, and my dad looked at them, and he said they were all just teenagers. They were just teenagers. He thought it was awful. And he told me that at that point, World War II became different to him. Up to that point, it was really just a big beer party, kind of a good time in uniform, even though he knew there was a war going on. And he said at that point, when he saw those bodies, and he said they were all just teenagers. He said right then, he said, I knew that war is a bad, bad thing. Those were his words. War is a bad, bad thing. And I asked him what they thought of the Germans. I asked him a lot of questions, and the Japanese. My father said they fought the Germans because they had to. He was angry at them for starting the war and the Holocaust. They would find out after the war. He said they should have known better. They were good people. They should have known better than to elect someone like Hitler. And let me adjust my camera a little bit here. He said they fought the Germans because they had to, and they fought the Japanese because they hated them. Well, I guess you're going to get the wall in this. Oops, darn it, yeah. Those are his words. Here's a picture of my father in Casablanca in a bar in 1942. And he told me about that night. That's his buddy, and looks like they're doing some shots, drinking, something my father didn't do much of. He said they got into a fight that night. My dad wasn't a fighter, and his buddy got into a fight with some other sailor. My dad tried to break him up, and my dad wound up getting punched in the eye. And he remembered that. And so that's that, and I'll just put up pictures as I see fit, as I find them. What else? His ship was, I think, the only one that came back from his escort. Actually, it was quite dangerous. He wound up in the North Atlantic on one of these destroyers. And the North Atlantic is a very, very rough sea. And you got the American Navy on these destroyers. They called them tin cans because there wasn't really much to them. They weren't very thick-walled or anything like you'd think. And one of them got sunk by a sub with all hands went down. And my father felt bad about that because he knew one of the guys that went down on it. And he said the man was a card shark on his ship. And the guy was hustling everybody out of their paychecks playing poker on payday. And my father thought it was wrong, and he complained to the commander about it of the ship, and they transferred the man off the ship to this other destroyer in their group of 4 ships. And that ship's the one that got torpedoed and it got sank with all hands went down with it. That's what my father told me. He told me their ship was torpedoed, and he said the torpedo came in and it did not detonate. And he said water was piling in all over the place. He said he thinks he aged 20 years when that happened. And it just stuck halfway through the hull and didn't go off. He also felt guilty about another man's death on his ship. There was a guy on his ship that was a hardcore drinker. He had a habit of getting completely blitzed whenever they had shore leave. For whatever reason, to pull in some port, this guy would get wicked drunk. And his commander put the man on guard duty on the ship. So when they were in some port, I don't know where, America or Britain, or who knows, maybe Casablanca, I don't know. And the guy paid my dad money to pull his guard duty for him. And my dad wasn't much of a drinker, really. He said he liked to drink, but he said it was a blessing. He couldn't drink much because when he drank, he was sick for many days. He'd be sick for 3 days, sick, throwing up sick. He had alcohol did not agree with him, or he would have drank a lot, he told me, because he liked it, but it didn't like him. And this man paid him money to pull his guard duty. My dad did, and the man got drunk, and he was walking back up the ship, staggering on the gangway. You know, here's the harbor, and here's the ship, and you got a plank where you walk up and get on your ship. And the guy slipped and fell off the gangway and hit his head on something and died. And my father felt responsible for that because he pulled this guy's guard duty knowing that the man was a notorious drunk. I remember that story. He didn't talk about World War II a whole lot. Later on in life, when I was about 5 or 6 or 7 actually, when we lived in San Jose, California, my father, he had his World War II uniforms. They were always hanging up in the closet. And this is like 20 years after my dad got out. But you know what? I've been out that long and I got my uniforms hanging up still. Don't ask me why. I'll never fit in those again. But I still have them. Some were hanging up in the garage and some are upstairs. Well, we took his uniforms out to the playground a little ways behind our house, my brothers and I, and we're putting them on and playing around. And my dad was really thin when he was in the Navy. He, like me, put weight on when he got around 40 or 50-ish. He started putting on weight. And we left his playground, his Navy uniforms out on the playground. And I remember my mother said, "Ray," she said, "the children have left your uniforms out at the playground," and it was dark out. And because she wanted us to go get them, but it was dark. And my father said, "Leave them there." And she said, no, they're your uniforms." She says, "No." I remember my father said this. He said, "Leave them there." He says, "I never want to see those things again." Those were his words. I remember him saying that to her. "I never want to see those things ever again." That's what he said. And you know, going back a little to pre-World War II, right before World War II, and right before when my father joined the Navy in '39, story has it, he was about to be picked up by the Chicago Cubs to play pro baseball because he was playing semi-pro in Brooklyn. And I heard that he was noticed, by like whoever, talent scouts or people, and he said he was about to be picked up by the Chicago Cubs to play pro ball. And then he wound up going into the Navy instead. And this is where his Abilene love comes in. I don't know her name. I asked what happened to her, and when he went in the Navy. And he told me he was out to sea, and they used to write back and forth. They wrote letters to each other. My dad was in World War II for 6 years. Well, he was in the whole thing. Pretty much enlisted in 39, but pretty much 1940 to 1945 or 6. I'm not sure which, the exact dates. He said one day he got a letter from her. It was a Dear John letter, pretty much. She told him that she'd met another man, and that man was in the Army. He was a captain in the Army. And my father made it to my rank, the same rank I made in the Army. He made E7, Senior Sergeant. My father was a Chief Petty Officer on a ship. He was in charge of everybody in the engine room, boiler room. And I said, how did you handle that when you got that letter? I asked him. And he said, I just put it out of my mind. Oh, and he said, yeah, there was a war on, and we had a very dangerous job, and he was in charge of a lot of people in the boiler room and below decks. And he said he put it out of his mind completely, and because he had to focus on his job. Now here's another thing about him. He had a pistol that he carried. You know, his own personal, he bought a pistol somewhere. And being a senior man below decks, he had an agreement with all the guys he worked with that if the ship capsized and they were trapped, you know, the ship tips over and capsized or sank, and they're trapped like below decks in an air pocket with no hope of survival but just a slow death. My father had an agreement with everybody in his group that he would shoot them and he would use the last bullet on himself. And he always carried that pistol with him. And I remember him telling me that when the war was over, he turned the pistol in, but he wished he'd kept it because everybody else was keeping things and nobody was checking. I remember him telling me that about his war service. He was quite proud of his war service and made some lifelong friends from his ship. And I remember my father died actually. I thought it was 2004. It was in November of 2004, 2005. I think it must have been 2005. I covered that in one of my videos on him. He was born again. He accepted Jesus Christ right before he died. Lucky for him and me. My mother got a letter from one of his few surviving shipmates. They're all gone now, certainly. And the guy was telling my mother what a great man my father was and how he was real good at math. That to pass time, you know, below decks in the boiler room, my father would teach all these shipmates, teach them how to do very complex math tables in their head. He taught them math and how to do really complex stuff mathematically in their mind. And my dad was real good with math, and he was an engineer after the war. Engineer, designed things, electrical and parts and things. Not that type of engineer. He worked for NASA and some other places. So the war concluded and my father got out and met his first wife in Brooklyn, New York, and started a family. And my two half-sisters were born in 46 and 47. And then my brother, Ray, his first son, named after him, was born in 57, 10 years later. And then his wife died of leukemia in Brooklyn, New York. And my father wound up as a widower in 1957, I guess, 57 or 58. I don't know much about this. And so he's a widower with two daughters and a baby, son. And at that point, somehow, I don't know how, but he wound up living down by Washington, D.C. And he met my mother then in 59. And he was lonely, alone, and so was my mother. And my mother had my brother, Mark, my oldest brother, and she wound up as a widow. And my father was a widower, and they both had kids. And they kind of met, it wasn't a personals, but my father put an advert in the newspaper looking for a housekeeper. And he worded it in a way, my mother told me, that it was clear he was looking for a life partner, you know. And my mother met him, and you say what you want. That's how you meet somebody one way or the other, you know. And I was the product of that. But do the math, they were married before I was conceived. That's fact. You do the math. So it wasn't a shotgun wedding kind of thing. They got married, they fell in love and got married. And they stayed married. They honored their vows right up till my father died, till death did part them, ultimately. To their credit, a rare thing these days, isn't it? And my mother and father had a good span of years between them. They had 17 or 18 years between them. You know, but they stayed married. All right, so now we're getting up into 1960 or so. And in Woodbridge, Virginia, I came around, so it was my mom, my dad, and I'll just put up some old family pictures with my mother and father and us little kids here and there at this point. Let me write down the time. I'm just going to flash up pictures at this point for the most part. And from Woodbridge, Virginia, I don't remember Virginia, but I was born in Fredericksburg, which is by there. My mother was working in the FBI, of all places, in Washington, D.C. when my mom and dad met. And she was also singing. She was singing, kind of professional singer, my mother was. That's a tribute on my mom. And she had a beautiful voice, and she was singing on radio, which was a big deal back then. And she had a spot to sing on TV, but she wound up pregnant with me, and she had to make a choice, you know. Is she going to pursue a professional career as an entertainer, or is she going to raise a family? And she chose to raise a family. She didn't think it would be conducive to being a Christian mother to, you know, go around singing on TV in that lifestyle, she thought. So my father and her and us kids moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and write down notes. And I remember that place was kind of nice. We lived on the outskirts of Albuquerque, and my dad loved the desert. And we used to go up, that's where my first story on YouTube, the Angel story, took place there. My father took us camping, on a cookout up where he used to like hiking around in the mountains, and he was well into his 40s, mid-40s at this point. And he liked to go rock hunting and get turquoise and, you know, different quartz and things, rocks, and he'd polish them up and make jewelry out of them. And that's where one of these trips, he took us up there on a cookout in the Sandia Mountains, north of Albuquerque, way back when the Beatles were just starting to play. Put it in perspective, Vietnam, we were just getting involved in that mess. And, which I missed, I was too young for. No problem. I'm certain I would have gone if I was of age. As would have my brothers. And when we were in Albuquerque, my brother Zach came along, their second and last child of their marriage, and the youngest of the entire group, like the Brady Bunch. He had my father with his two teenage daughters who moved away. They both his daughters were teenagers, and they moved from, when we were in Albuquerque, they both moved to New York City. And I can still remember them taking them to the bus stop and saying goodbye to them. I'll never see them again in our family. They both moved to New York City and married Italian men in the 60s. So that left my mom, my dad, my brother Mark, my brother Ray, my brother Zach, myself. And We used to go up in the mountains a lot with my dad. My dad really loved it there. I heard Albuquerque's kind of dangerous, crime town now, full of gangbangers. But back then it wasn't. America was a safer place back then. Cities weren't so crime. Their bad guys always existed. Always. So after a few years in Albuquerque, maybe about 5 years in Albuquerque, which I have fond memories of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Boy, what a place. I love cowboy movies and cowboys and Indians. And we lived right in our backyard. The desert was right there. You could walk right out and walk into the desert. And all these like horny toads and things were out there. Rattlers, you had to be careful. Cactus. It was pretty cool. Well, from there we moved. My father took a job and we moved to San Jose, California in 1967, I believe. 66 or 67. And at that point, I liked it there too. I remember the ocean. It was my first time going to see the ocean. My father used to take us, the family, to the ocean, the beach. It was really nice. The Pacific Beach in California and the ocean in New York State, two different animals. I remember sea lions and going there when the tide was out, walking around the tidal pools in California, starfish and all kinds of aquatic life. It was when I was like 6 or 7. I thought it was just plain amazing. It was really nice. I remember that. It was nice. I remember the hippies. My father used to take us to Yosemite National Park camping a lot, the family. And I don't know if I have any pictures of that. Oh, I do somewhere. I don't know. But we used to go there, and I remember the hippies. This was like 67. And I remember one time, my father was big into photography. He always was a big shutter bug. He always had to have the latest 35 millimeter camera stuff. He had his own black room where he developed his own film. And it was a lifelong hobby with him. He liked to have the best sound system. We had the first color TV on our block. And he always had the best camera stuff he could get. My father was a techno kind of guy. And if he was around today, he'd probably have the best cell phone you could get. And computers, he'd probably been totally into computers. They were really he was a pretty old man by the time computers came into play, where it was household items. I mean, he played around the computers a little bit later in life, but not much. But I remember we were driving out of Yosemite Park one time, and my father had a light meter, which was a black, back then, 1967 light meter, so when he could, set his 35 millimeter camera up to the light, the ambient light. And I guess it was kind of an expensive thing. I remember it was like a black box about as big as a can, but square. A can of soup that size, but square. And he left it on top of the car, and we'd been driving for a while, station wagon. And he said, "Oh God, my meter's on top of the car." And it fell off the car, and you could see it. And I still remember looking back and seeing his light meter hitting the road. And he turned around real quick to go back and get it. And this guy in a truck, like a big truck, old truck, but like a semi, that guy swerved out of his way and ran over my dad's light meter before he pulled over. He was about to go out and get it, and this guy in a truck went out of his way and ran over it and kept going. There's always been jerks, always. I'm here to tell you. The good old days, there have always been people who've done things like that, and worse. I remember that. I remember a lot of stuff. I remember my father worked for NASA and when he was in California as an engineer, and they had that accident where the 3 astronauts burned up in their space capsule. They weren't going into space. They were just testing out some equipment. So the astronauts all loaded up into this space capsule, 1967-ish. One of their names was White. I remember that. I'm not sure what year it was, but we lived there, and my father worked for NASA. And when that happened, and those poor guys burned up in that thing, they couldn't get them out. And man, that hurt my father bad. He was very upset over that. I remember that. Well, at some point we moved to Charleston, West Virginia. My father worked for for FMC. I don't know what that stands for. But we moved to West Virginia and South Charleston. We lived in South Charleston. We moved first we lived in the city, Armour Park, which was right next to this filthy canal river. And I've got some stories about that. A Man on the Bridge. One of my angel stories comes from that. And then we moved a little bit out of the city into the countryside, into the mountains. And I remember Forest Circle Drive was a road we lived on there. I got a good memory of my childhood stuff. I remember quite a bit. And my mom and dad never argued much. Very rarely. They would have an occasional argument. It never came to anything. I want to talk about this. My father was a very quiet man, very even-tempered. I saw him drunk. He got drunk once a year, if that. But he would drink amaretto on Christmas Eve. For some reason, it's the only time of the year he would drink, and he would drink amaretto. He would drink beer now and then, but if he bought a six-pack, the beer would sit in the refrigerator for 6 months. He might open one beer up every few months and just drink it while he's watching a baseball game. So neither of my parents were drinkers or partiers at all. I had a milk and cookies childhood. My mom was a stay-at-home mom and kept the house, and we had a nice house. Nothing rich, middle class, clean neighborhood. It was segregated. It was all segregated back then. We lived in the white section, obviously, in Charleston. And I remember that. There was a black section in Charleston too, but whites didn't go there either. And they didn't come into our neighborhood, and we didn't go into theirs. And so you just rarely saw anybody. You know, just a sign of the times. And but we always had a nice car. My dad always seemed to have a new car and a nice house. And Christmas and birthdays, everybody got gifts. And we ate well, and everything was milk and cookies, you know. Went to church, and though my father was agnostic up until his last day on earth, right before he died, he accepted Jesus Christ, and I was there to witness that. But he was an agnostic, and my mother respected that, because my mother was at least as much, I don't know, comparing Christianity, my mother loved Lord. She lived for Jesus Christ and God. And Jesus Christ and God were central to her life as long as I knew her. Central. And she loved to tell people about Jesus and things like that. My father, he respected that. But he didn't know what he believed. He believed there was a God, but he wasn't sure. Those were where he stood. He believed in ghosts, but he never saw a ghost until he did. He was probably 75 when he started seeing ghosts. I remember that. My dad believed that there could be such thing as ghosts, but he wasn't sure because he never saw one. Later, more on that. I'll tell it now in case I forget, because this isn't scripted. He told me when he was at my mother had a nursing home here where I live in Moravia. Moravia's a haunted town. Well, a lot of people died in that house. You know, people generally don't leave nursing homes. I hate to say it, it's sad, but they don't leave alive usually. Very few left there alive. But to my mom's credit, the average stay in a nursing home is, I don't know what the years were, not much, 2 years or something like that. When they were with my mom, they would go a lot longer. My mom took very good care of people, right up to their last breath. So that place had some ghost stories, and I told a story about my mom's house, the hauntings, and there were. And all the staff, my mother, me, and eventually my father started experiencing hauntings there. And he told me about it. He was kind of excited because his whole life he never seen a ghost until there. He said he used to hear somebody call his name out, Ray, like that. He said, you know, a woman's voice, and there was nobody around. And it was right in the same room with him. And then he said one time he was in the kitchen with my mother, and a cookie jar, a heavy cookie jar, slid by itself all the way across the table. And they both watched that, and I'm not saying it didn't just move a little, it moved all the way across the counter, actually the counter. And he showed me that. He's kind of excited. And he had a couple other ghost stories from that place. So he came to believe in ghosts when he finally saw one, when he was probably 75-ish. He came to accept Jesus Christ as his personal Lord and Savior the last day of his life, probably 2 hours before he died. And I told him that. I told him that on this channel, and I'm not going to recover that. So we're in West Virginia, all right? Around 1969, 1970, my father took a job with Xerox as an engineer. Xerox, Xerox. And they were in Rochester, New York. And they were a big name. They made copiers and things like that. And they didn't keep up with the times. They wound up going under. But when my dad worked with them, they were a big name. A pretty big name, Xerox. And he took a job with them, and he moved up and got a house in Sodus, New York, S-O-D-U-S. It was a nice house too. I really liked that house. I think it was on Smith Street. We lived on the second house. I think it was 20 Smith Street. We lived on 20 Smith Street at one point, and that house was haunted. But we lived on another house on Smith Street before 20 Smith Street. And that house, I didn't have any, there was a ghost, no, I didn't have any ghost stories from that house. My dad did. My dad, again, had a ghost story. And that's the one I made a story about, my grandfather's passing, my mother's father. And my dad was with him alone on my grandfather Jasper Wooten on his final day. And after my grandfather died and was dead, we were out of state. My mom was driven down with us boys to pick up her younger sister so they could come see their father before he died, who was living with us. But they didn't make it. He died while we were in Virginia. And my father, I remember my father was talking to my mother when we got back, a day or two later. And I overheard my father talking to my mother. And he told her, funny thing happened. He said, after your dad died, he told her, I heard him whistling that song that he liked a lot, Bluebird. And my grandfather liked this song, Bluebird, and he used to whistle it all the time. He said, I could hear him whistling that song all throughout the house after he died, Jasper. And he said, I thought somebody was playing a prank on me. And my father looked all through the house, like somebody's hiding. Like me, he didn't think ghost instantly. But then he realized that he was alone in the house. And he's hearing somebody whistling that song, Bluebird, that my grandfather liked. I remember that. Well, at this point, I want to back up a little bit because Aunt Toot died around the same time in the early 70s. The beloved Aunt Marjorie Toot, who brought my father up. And my dad always loved her. They were very close. And she must have been 80 or so when she died. And I remember her as an old woman. And my parents they'd drop me off to stay with her. She liked me a lot. Imagine that, when I was a baby. And all I remember of her, I do have a memory of her. And she had this accent, this Scottish accent. And I didn't know what an accent was. She used to scare me. Oh, Tiba! And she pinched my cheeks, and I didn't like that. You know what I mean? And my parents left me with her, for a couple of weeks, I think. And once I got over the accent and the fact that she pinched I was a fat baby. I was a real fat baby. Yeah, you don't need to see a baby picture of me. This is about my dad. But she raised my father, and she also looked after me a little, and she loved me very much. Aunt Margaret, Aunt Toot. And she liked me so much, she left me her wedding rings. And I remember that, even though I was only like 11 years old when she died. And my father went to go to her funeral. He went alone to Chicago, it says wherever, Wilmington, Illinois, which was more rural then than it is now. So you got to put it in context. But I remember when he came back from her funeral, like a week later, visiting with family out there. And his father died not too long after that out there. More on that after I finish this. I remember my mother arguing with him. I overheard their argument, and she said, "But Ray, those were Tim's." And he said, "I know." He said, "But my father said he was broke. But he took the wedding rings that my Aunt Toot willed her wedding rings to me. Personally, took the time to write it in her will. And my father sold them. He said that he needed the money to get home, that he had run out of money out there. And these are the days before bank cards. So he sold the wedding rings that were willed to me to get home. I forgive him for that, but I remember that. And here's something else, West Virginia. Going back to West Virginia. I keep remembering things. I'm sorry, I did not script this. Before we moved to New York, we lived in the mountains in West Virginia, outside of Charleston, South Charleston. And my brothers and I used to go all through the mountains. We had a blast. Swinging on vines like Tarzan, running on trails, barefoot. And we used to go fossil hunting in this like ravine that was behind our house. And I pulled this rock out of this like ledge. And I am not kidding you. I had a rock with a human footprint on it. A human footprint on this rock. You know how much that would be worth today? It's somewhere. I knew it was pretty cool. And my dad thought it was really cool. It was a human footprint about that big. Human. That'd be worth a lot of money. Nowadays it would be worth a lot of money. I pulled it right out of the side of this mountain. And it was like slate or something, but I pulled this rock out and there was a human footprint. Very distinct human footprint. Like a plaster cast. Well, I remember one of my mother's brothers came to visit. I don't remember which one. And I remember my dad, they were sitting around the table at night, and my dad was telling them about this thing I found with a footprint. And he asked me to get it, and I got it. And my dad was showing it to my uncle, who thought it was really super cool, because it was. And you know what? My dad gave him that. And that was mine. My dad told him to keep it. That my father was raised that way. I forgot that my father was raised Victorian, by Victorians. I forgot to mention that. The Pennsylvania Dutch, the German farmers on his side, they spoke German, some of them. On my dad's Shenk side, they spoke German. And they ran really good farm. I'm backing up some. I'm talking about everything I can remember. And they were very strict, but they ran a very good farm. And Joseph Shenk, my father's grandfather, was a very, very, very wealthy man. My middle namesake. I was named after him. He made a lot of money in Chicago and Illinois. He was a very prominent man, almost like the Rockefellers were, to New York. But he was a very, very wealthy man. And my understanding is that people in the Shenk family out in Illinois are still living off some of his money to this day. To this day. That's how much he owned property and land, a lot. When he left the Mennonites, he became extremely successful at whatever he did. And my father's family, my dad's dad never got any of that money because my dad's dad disappeared for a couple of years. I'm backing up a lot, backtracking, but I'm sorry, that's the way it is as this stuff comes up. When my father's mother, Myrtle, died tragically, when my dad was a very small child, like I said, his father kind of lost it. And I don't know what happened. My dad never talked about it. But my grandfather, Raymond Ros, the first Raymond Ros that I know of, he disappeared for a while. Dropped my dad off with his Aunt Toot, his mother's sister, took care of my father. and some of the German farmers took care of his brother his brother Clarence, his older brother, went to stay with the German farmers. I say German farmers, they were American, but they spoke German. And I remember we went out there once, and they were strict. Well, I remember then one woman coming after me with a broom because I was doing something on their farm they didn't like as a kid. Well, I mean, she didn't hate me. They were very strict people. They had a really big farm. So my dad went to live with Aunt Margaret, Aunt Toot, in the east sides of Chicago, which turned out to be fortunate for him because he had a very colorful, very good childhood, good memories. And he never spoke. His father came back and moved into the area, and his older brother Clarence got along good with his father, but my dad never forgave him. I know that's dark, but I'm just telling you the truth. He never would talk to him, and he never talked of him. I never heard much about my grandfather Raymond because it was just a no-go area to talk about. And he didn't talk about his mother either, not because it was just painful to him to lose his mother. And I didn't learn she was from Scotland till way later in his life. He just never spoke of her. I didn't know much about her. And so that takes us up into the 70s. And then his father died, and my father forbid anybody. My mom wanted to send flowers, and my dad wouldn't allow it. So, I don't know what to tell you. I don't go there. That was a no-go topic. But I am telling you the truth. And it's sad. It's sad. I mean, it's sad. Everybody has their own walk in life. So, that's that. So we lived in Sodus Point. My dad started working for a place called Dynelect, which was a corporation in Sodus. And they made communication systems for U.S. Navy ships. That was their big thing. All the communication systems came out of Dynelect, and my father designed a lot of that stuff. My dad also designed parts for the space shuttle. Not the parts that blew up, that was a coupling. My dad worked for NASA. I did a lot of design work for different military. My father designed this was the M113 personnel carrier, or we call them tracks in the Army. They must have made 1 million of those things. The U.S. Army and Marines, they used those for a good 30 years. It was a really good system. I've ridden in them. They were a little outdated by the time I joined the Army. But they're armored personnel carrier, and my father designed the entire suspension system for the M113 personnel carrier. My dad did that. He designed parts for the space shuttle. My dad designed, he gave it to us when I was a teenager and I started playing guitar. He designed and built a little mini amp that you could plug in, a portable amp. He could have made a lot of money off that. Because this was before, they used to call them a pig nose, which is a little tiny amp. You put batteries and you plug your guitar into it. This was before those came out. My dad designed one and gave it to us, and it worked very well. Well, he's pretty good with this stuff. I'm going on an hour here, but there's no time limit. I don't expect anybody to watch this. I'm putting this down for posterity's sake, and the pictures as well, which I'm just going to plug in here and there. So he retired from Dynelect in his early 60s, and I remember he bought a lot of carpentry tools. My dad was a really good carpenter, and I'm not talking build a house type carpenter, though he could do that. He was a cabinet maker. He built really fine woodwork stuff, and he was very good at it. And he was good at that. He was a really good photographer, and he always had the best sound equipment. He got me into, like I listened to the music him and my mom listened to when I was a little kid. He liked Marty Robbins, which we used to listen to when we lived out in New Mexico. Marty Robbins was kind of like a cowboy singer from the early 60s. My dad got me into Peter, Paul, and Mary, who I still love Peter, Paul, and Mary. They're my favorite folk group, still. I remember they got me into Peter, Paul, and Mary back when I was a little kid, just like my dog likes to hear accordion music, because my dog was a little puppy, 5 weeks old when I got him, and I was playing accordion a lot then, and my dog just came to think, I think accordion, Jen and I were together then, and I think the sound of accordion takes my dog back to happy times. My dog loved Jen too, and he loved accordion music. Jen loved the accordion, my accordion playing. I can't even, I'm looking at it right now, I don't even pick it up. I got nobody that likes to hear it, nobody. So I can play it for my dog, and he starts howling, then he stops. Everything changes in life. Where did I leave off? My dad retired when he was about my age, and he completely retired. At that point, my mom was running a nursing home, and between Social Security and my mother's work, they did pretty well. They were middle class, upper middle class, I'd say. At that point, I moved out when I was about 19, got married at 19, started my own family, and then went into the Army for a long time. And at some point while I was in the Army, my mom and dad wound up living, they had this beautiful home I want to mention called the Summit House. It was in Alton, New York, Alton, that I grew up in as a teenager. Alton is part of Sodus. So they just moved a few miles out of Smith Street where we first moved, and they moved up to this beautiful mansion in Alton, 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 New York. And my mom bought that, and the place it still is gorgeous. The place would sell for millions nowadays. I mean, this house had something like 7 fireplaces, 11 bathrooms. No, not 11 bedrooms. I think it had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No, I had 4 or 5 fireplaces. How many bathrooms? 1, 2, 3. It had like 7 bathrooms. The place was a mansion. Had 365 apple trees on the property. Had a creek that ran through the property. It was beautiful. Stone house. It's beautiful. Well, when I was in the Army, they moved out of there, and they moved to King Ferry, New York first, and that would be the mid-'80s. Then I went back in the Army. I got out for 6 months, and I wound up going back. Couldn't find any work. And at King Ferry, they moved right here to Moravia, which would be their final home, both for my mother and my father. Though they had ambitions to build and do other things, none of it would ever happen. So, what else to say about my father? He was a quiet man, but you didn't want to get him upset. If my mother disciplined us, my mother disciplined us, but if it got out of, she couldn't discipline us when we were kids and teenagers. When she said, "I'm going to tell your father about this," my heart would sink. Because if you got in trouble with my dad, you're in big trouble. I mean, he was the most quiet, meekest person I can think of, but he could have a rage too. He had no tolerance for kids bad-mouthing their parents. None. It must have been the way he was raised. I don't know. It couldn't have been if he was raised by Aunt Toot and that Irishman. I don't know. He didn't want to upset my dad. It was very rare that he got involved in the discipline. But if he did, you were in trouble. Yeah, definitely. I remember that about him. Otherwise, he was extremely quiet. Come home from work when he worked. Watched TV. Did woodwork. Between woodwork and TV. And we'd eat breakfast together as a family, and we'd eat dinner together as a family. And we'd say prayers. What else do I remember about Dad? To say about Dad? There's so much I'm going to remember that I forgot. I said, I wish I would have said that about him. Going back to his first love from Abilene, Texas. When he was probably about 80 years old, 80, he got a letter from her. And he hadn't heard, last time he heard from her was when he was out to sea in World War II, when he got a Dear John goodbye letter. Well, she found him. Somehow she found him and wrote him a long letter. And my mother read it, actually, and my dad just was beaming like, like a schoolboy my mother was kind of jealous. Well, she read the letter because they both actually thought it was very cute that this woman still remembered him fondly. And the woman had left my father in World War II for a guy who joined the army and became a captain. That guy turned out was killed in combat in Europe. And she was bringing my father up to date on her life since they last were together, like 1940. And the man she left my father for was killed in the war. And then she met another man, and they were married, and they had a family, and lived their lives. The children grew up and moved away, and then that man died, and left her alone. And she met another man and got married, and he didn't live very long after the marriage, and he died, and she had been alone since. And she wanted to know, she told me that, or no, she didn't tell me, she told my father in this letter, I forgot the words, but I do know she was very, very sorry that she left him like she did during World War II. She said she regretted it her whole life. Isn't that how it goes? You got true love. You stay with your true love in life. But people don't. So, but she really regretted it. And she always did. And at the end of the letter, she wanted my dad to know that wanted to know if he was single. She was still interested in seeing him. And they're both like 80 years old at this point. That was quite poignant, I thought. So that's what came of my dad's first love, that he met when he was a teenager, hopping the trains from Chicago all the way to Abilene, Texas, where she worked as a waitress at a diner. So that's how that story played out. And then my father started getting sick, started having strokes. Then he found out he had diabetes. He didn't even know he had diabetes when he was in his 60s. And he had cancer, which he survived. And he survived the strokes. But little by little, he had like 3 strokes. The first one, he recovered from that fairly well. Then he had one he couldn't drive anymore, which was sad. And he must have been about 70. But he really couldn't see on this side. He could see fine, but this side he couldn't see. And he was pulling out in front of cars like crazy. And my mother was telling him, you can't drive anymore. And it really broke his heart not to be able to drive anymore. And he got me in and talked to me to get into a car with him to prove that he could still drive to my mother. I got in a car with him reluctantly because I already knew that he was pulling out in front of cars, really dangerous. And he almost got us in 2 accidents. And we got back, and this was really hard. He told me, tell your mother I can drive. I said, Dad, and he did. He almost got us in 2 very severe accidents. And he looked at me like I betrayed him. But he had to admit that I was right, and he never drove again. That's sad, but that's life. That's what I'm coming my way. At least he had my mom to help. He had people to look after him. You know? There's another thing about my dad. Nothing ever bothered him. Nothing much. That bothered him a little bit that he couldn't drive, but he got over it. He had my mom to drive him around and other people. So he sold his car, and he always had nice cars. His first car was an Edsel. He told me that, for whatever it's worth. It was an Edsel. No, he had a Packard with a rumble seat. His first car was a Packard with a rumble seat that he got when he was in the Navy, and he and his friends bombed around on that a lot, his Navy friends. All right. He used to like to drive Renaults. He had a Maverick. He had a Ford LTD. Yeah, it was a nice car. I bought that off him. What else? One of the few times I used to joke about how my father, nothing ever ruffled him. And here's another thing about my dad. He was quite charming. He could be very charming, and even when he was like my age, teenage girls liked him. My friends, they all thought my dad was so hot, so cute. When I was a teenager, I'm like, what about me, right? Everybody, they all loved my dad. Even when he was up in his 60s, women all thought he was very, very attractive, cute man. They liked him a lot. My dad liked it. He liked the attention. He didn't have a lot of friends either. He's just my mother. My mother said that about me once. She said, "You're just like your father." I said, "You're just a one-woman kind of guy." And I said, "What do you mean by that?" He says, "You've got your woman in your life and you don't really have a lot of friends. It's just, you just with your woman." Well, she was right about that for the most part. And yeah, my dad didn't have a lot of friends. He had a few from work, and he kept up a little bit with some of his old Navy friends, but very little. When he had stomach cancer, that didn't seem to faze him much. Though I understand he was in a lot of pain when they removed that tumor that was about as big as a grapefruit, I heard. I wasn't around for that. He was in a lot of pain for a little while. But when my mother came down with cancer, and I went with her to the hospital, she had a double mastectomy. And I've got a ghost story from that hospital trip. I stayed overnight with her at the hospital. I came home early. My mother got through the surgery fine, but the doctor told me, I asked him how it went, and he said not good. He didn't get the cancer. And I came home and I saw my dad. This was probably around the year 2000. And he said, "How'd it go? The news?" And I didn't lie to my dad. I said it didn't go well. The doctor said he wasn't able to get it all. And my dad went, "Oh, darn." That's the most upset I ever saw my father, was when I gave him that news. And my mom would go on to fight the cancer, and it metastasized all through her body, but she beat it. She did beat it. And cancer is not what didn't get my mom. COVID-19 got her. So my father started getting sick, but he always seemed to survive. And he took getting ill in stride. I remember once he was in the hospital, I think it was one of his strokes. And my mom called and said, "You better get to the hospital. The doctor says your father doesn't have long to live." So we're all racing to the hospital, and I get there in Ithaca, New York, Ithaca. And my father's in the hospital bed, and he's unconscious. Eyes are closed. He's not moving. And he's not supposed to live even an hour. And we're all weepy around him. Everybody was crying and weepy, naturally. And my dad would go on to live a good number of years after that. That would have been the 90s. Oh no, when was that? Sometime around, I don't know when it was. Late 90s, 2000. And my dad told me, he said, I knew I was sick. He said, but I didn't think anything of it. He said, I couldn't open my eyes. I couldn't talk. He said, but I could hear everything every one of you was saying. He said, but I just couldn't respond. He said, when I thought I was fine, and it turned out he would be fine. He said, but when I heard you all crying around my bed, he said, I started getting scared, thinking I'm going to die. He said he's just laying there, looking like he was dead to the world, but he wasn't. And he said he was fine until he heard everybody crying, but he couldn't go, "Hey, stop," or something. He couldn't even move. I thought that was funny, honestly. So flash forward to November 2005, I believe. Once again, I got a call, better get to the hospital. My father was sick with, there was a bug going around, really bad flu bug. My dad got it. He had pneumonia. So he was 86. I figured, well, it's just another false alarm. I got to the hospital, and that would be the night that my father died. But I can tell you that he was in very good spirits. He couldn't breathe. They had a tube down his throat. He had a hard time talking because of that tube. But he did talk, and he was smiling. His friend was a pastor, and that man just died this year. And he wasn't much older than me, but he was a good friend of my father's. and he was a pastor in Groton, New York. And they had one thing in common. They loved the Chicago Cubs. And that man's wife worked for my mom. That's how they met. So that man and my father were good friends. Well, that man showed up at my father's deathbed when I was there the night my father died. A long time ago already. And that man talked to my dad about Jesus. And I was there to hear all this. And my dad accepted Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior. And I know because that man was there. His friend was a pastor and said, "Ray, do you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior?" He says, "I want to have a talk with you." Because they were joking about the Cubs and stuff. And he says, "Now I want to have a talk with you about Jesus Christ," because that man knew my father was going to die. And that they told me he was going to die, and I didn't believe it because he seemed fine. I mean, other than being sick, but he was able to laugh a little and talk a little. He didn't look deathly ill. But that nurse told me, they said no, they said they always bounce back like that right before they die. That's what the guy said. He said, a male nurse told me that. He said, he was sad. He said, "I'm sorry." He said, "But he's going to die, and they always bounce back often, like right before they die." And my dad seemed fine. But that man talked to him about Jesus Christ, and my father said yes. He said, "Do you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior?" And my father said, "Yes, I do." My father got a great big smile on his face. He says, "I do accept Jesus Christ." So I remember that. Sorry to get choked up. Why do I share personal things on here? I ask myself often, why are you sharing all these personal things? Why not? It gives glory to God. And I'm paying tribute to my father. I'm here to tell you, he accepted Jesus Christ in the last hour of his life, and he was lucky to be able to do so. But he did, and I witnessed it. And my dad, see, it's another thing about my dad. When I was growing up throughout my life, I never heard him say "I love you." I never got a hug from him. Never even shook hands. We always knew we loved each other. But he was like me. He didn't say it much. He didn't speak it. I wasn't raised that. My dad wasn't a huggy type of guy with his kids. You know, that's just the way he was. Probably because, you know, his own two parents, what happened in his childhood. But, you know, it's not to say that I knew my dad loved me. I knew he did. We all knew it, you know. You can show your love to people in more ways than, you know, hugs and love you and all that. I didn't get that. The only time he said love you was, and I never told him I loved him either. Though he knew it, you know. It was kind of a Victorian kind of, everybody had their place in the family. Kind of like a Victorian way. Really. And I told him at his last, right before he died, he had like 15 minutes left. And I was getting choked up. My mom was with him, holding his hand. And he had his eyes open, but he couldn't see because his senses were starting to check out. And I told him I loved him. I said, I'm going to step out of the room. I wanted to give him and my mom some time together alone. But that was what I said. But really, I was just being a coward. I didn't want to watch him breathe his last breath. And I told him I loved him. And he said to my mom told me after I left the room, he said, "Who said that?" And she said, "That was Tim, your son Tim." And she said, sorry, I'm going to get choked up. She said that he got a great big peaceful smile on his face. And he said, "That's so nice." He got a big smile. He said, "Oh, that's so nice." And then he died. He breathed his last breath out. He raised his hand up and looked up. And his hand came down and he was dead. And that's how he left the world. But his last words were, "That's so nice," when my mom told him that that was me that said, "I love you, Dad." And when I came back in the room, he was laying there. Looked like he was asleep, but something about, in his eyes, my mom closed his eyes. Something about when somebody's dead, they become very inanimate. I mean, to look at him, he didn't look ghastly. I've seen dead people, and usually doesn't do your appearance any good. I don't care who you are. My dad looked like he was sleeping, but he wasn't moving. There was no, you could tell, he was about as still as a rock, you know. And I said, I sensed that his spirit was still in the room. And I sensed that he was up in the corner. It sounds weird. That he was up in the corner looking down at us. That he was okay. And I walked over. I didn't want to do this around people because people were coming in at this point into the room. And I looked at the corner and there was a window there, and I opened the window and I said, Dad, I said, you've passed on. And I had some words. I said, I love you very much. And I was looking right up at the corner, and I felt certain that that's where he was at. His spirit was up in the corner of that room looking down at the whole scene. And I said, you can go, you can move on now, be happy, go on, be with the Lord Jesus, and go into the light. And I felt that my father did go at that point, that he traveled on at that point, his spirit. And my mother made that comment about him too. I'm going to wrap this up in a few minutes. She told me, this was my mother's words concerning my father's death. And my mother presided over a lot of people dying. She ran a nursing home from 1974 to 2018. My mother ran a nursing home. So she personally presided over, I don't know, 100, I don't know how many people died under her watch. Died a good death. My mom took very good care of them. The deceased people were always grateful to the care my mother gave them, right up a nursing home level, and then my mom became hospice for these people because their families wanted them to stay with my mother for good reason. Sorry. My mom said to me about my father's death, she said, death is a birthing canal. That's what she said. Death is a birthing canal. She said, I feel your father passed through successfully. Those were her words to me. And and then it was like, I don't know, 2 weeks later, or 2 months, weeks or months later, after my father died, and I'm going to be closing with this, my mother was very excited. She said my father had appeared to her, woke up, actually, yeah, she woke up, and my father was there, and he looked like he did when she met him. You know, that's to say in his 40s, and he was dressed like he was then. She said he had on what he always dressed. He had a white shirt with a tie, and he always wore a gray herringbone tweed jacket. I remember that. Gray herringbone tweed, like a dinner jacket. He had that thing forever. And she said, Ray, because he always used a walker, up until he broke his hip, which was partially my fault. I feel guilty. I got in an argument with my brother, and he came down the stairs to try to break up the argument, just a verbal argument, when he was an old man, and he fell down the stairs and broke his hip. And at that point, he had to use a walker, and some other things about my dad I'll talk about. Sorry, I'm backtracking. When he was about 80, that's when this happened. And then I asked him, so how is it getting old? When he was about 80. And he said, oh, not bad. He said, it's all right, you know, as long as you got, he said, but when you can't walk anymore, that's when it starts going downhill. You know, you can't get up to go to the bathroom, you can't go get something to eat, you know. But he said, other than that, it's all right. That's what he told me about getting old when he was 80. But he was in a walker, and when he appeared to my mother was quite excited. She said, he appeared to me. And she said, Ray, she said, my first thought was that he was just standing there without a walker, because he was using a walker for a long time before he died, until he couldn't even use a walker. And she says, where's your walker? And he said to her, oh, he says, I don't need that anymore. And he told her that he was doing all right, and that he told my mother that she had some things to do yet here in this life. That's what he told my mother. He said, you've got some things to do yet here. and he told my mother, I've got some other places I'm going to go, things to do. And he turned and walked away, and that was vanished. But she said he looked very well. He looked very healthy, happy. And that was a conversation. She said, "Where's your walker?" And he said, "I don't need that anymore." And he told my mother that she had things to do yet, people to help. That's what he told her. And my mother would live another 20 years. No, another 17 years my mother would live. 17 years more. And she would help a lot of people. Just like my father told her. I'm going to say this one more time. I hate to repeat. But this is what she said he said when he appeared to her. You know, it was like, I think a couple of months after he died. She said, "Ray, where's your walker?" And he said, "Oh, I don't need that anymore." He said, "But you've got things to do here." He said, "You've got people to help." That's what he told her. And he said, "I've got other places to go." And he turned and walked off and vanished. And I thought that was pretty cool. Honestly, my mom did too. And my mom would appear to me like she did. You know, and I read somewhere recently that 65% of people have these type of after-death visitations. So that's it. That's the story of my dad. I forgot a lot of things, but obviously I wanted to talk about him and pay tribute to him and put all these pictures up here just in case, you know, I had a flood and I lost a lot of things, you know, or a fire, flood, these things get lost. So I want to put this talk and these pictures up for posterity's sake. And I see I've gone on for a minute, almost an hour and a half. My timer here says 1 minute 26. So I'm going to close this with a prayer. Oh, dear God, I thank you for my father, Raymond Ros Shenk, Sr. I thank you for my grandparents and for his family. And I thank you, he was a good father to me. He set a good example. And he was a good provider. And I'm exceedingly grateful, Lord, that the pastor, that he accepted Jesus Christ, your son, before he died. Tell him I said hello. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. And tell my mom I said hello too. And my grandparents, that I never met any of my grandparents on that side. Or Aunt Toot, who left me her wedding rings, I just barely remember her. My dad loved her. I think Aunt Toot was his favorite human being, period. He really loved her. They're together. And his Chicago Cubs never won a World Series after that, like 19, I don't know when it was. But every year my dad would watch and hope to see the Chicago Cubs win. I remember that was a big event. If they made it to the World Series, it was a big, big event, and they never won. Not while he was alive. I think the year after he died, they won. They won their first World Series in ages. And somewhere I've got his Chicago Cubs ball cap around here. I'm actually looking at it. It's in a case. So, my father's buried in Sodus, New York, with my mother. And the cemetery in Sodus, right in the town. Well, that's that. Take care and God bless each of you.